Right, good evening, everyone. Glad you're all quiet because you're going to have to concentrate. So welcome to everyone on Zoom, welcome to everyone in the room. For those of you who don't know me, it's lovely to see some new faces as well, of course, seeing regulars. I'm Julie Trotter. I head up adult education here at WWII, which is a huge honour and great fun, and brought Piers to us, which is wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'll let Piers explain about this side of it, but just to say as well that he's a historical, cultural, restorative artist and sculptor. So it's not just Alderney that's important, it's art as well. He has a huge CV, far too much, and he has a lot of material to get through, so I don't want to spend more time, but we can look at that perhaps towards the end. So I'm sure you all know that we've got an hour session. Most of that will be Piers talking, and well, if there's time, we'll do some Q&A at the end. For those of you in the building, the cafe is open till 9:30, so we can continue the conversation afterwards. Those of you on Zoom, you have to get your own wine and coffee, and obviously not the falafel. We have had problems. We did lose our voice a week ago, were we? So we're hoping we've got ginger tea and water, and we're hoping it's going to last through, but I'm sure it will.
Yeah.
Piers, great thanks, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Julie. Good evening, everybody in the room. Thank you for attending this lecture at JW3. Thank you very much, everybody who's logged in via Zoom to hear this talk. I'm going to start with the first slide.
Sorry, not organised yet.
That's right. Okay. But to help you to understand why I've been researching Alderney for 3.5 years, I'm going to begin by giving you some background about my art practice. I studied painting at Chelsea College of Art between 1995 and 1998, and left art college with an abstract painting practice. Since then, I've focused on making sculptures out of paint, treating paint effectively as a sculptural medium by carving it, casting it, manipulating it in dozens of different ways. The work on the screen is a painting called Manifesto, which I made between 2000 and 2003. It's a solid block of paint, cube, which stands 74 centimeters high. In 2001, I was living in New York State, about 2.5 hours north of Manhattan. In the spring of that year, the Taliban destroyed the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, and then 6 months later, 9/11 happened. I couldn't take myself and my mind away from the enormity of these events, but I did know that if there were forces so determined to destroy culture, the culture which defines a place, it was going to have an effect on the way that I deal with my own art in the long run, and especially if those forces were going to bring the destruction to where I live. My studio practice started examining the deliberate destruction of culture. I had always felt strongly that the most significant thing an artist can do is to make work about the time in which they're living. In 2003, I moved back to London and started sculpting with an industrial floor paint, as shown here in an artwork titled Pending. It's the first piece that I made in reaction directly to an event, which was the July 2005 terrorist attacks in London. In Tavistock Square in central London, a bus was bombed. The sides of the bus splayed open, the roof was blasted off, and the handrails were left sticking up into the sky. This work is a response to the photographs in the press of that event. One of the most shocking elements about the bombing was the fact that it targeted the iconic symbols of both the London Underground and a red double-deck bus. It was the collision of culture, of the place, and the violent geopolitics. I realized that this was what I wanted to try to capture in my art somehow, the moment in which violent geopolitics and culture collide. Since then, most of my work has been about how and why this happens. In 2010, my work started to focus directly on the Taliban mostly because they were the most aggressive destroyers of culture in the world at that time. This work on the right-hand side of the screen was made by noting bullet damage from a wall in Kabul several weeks after the Taliban carried out a suicide bomb attack site on a private security firm, which was preceded by a shooting. The Taliban shot 2 employees of a private security firm as they sat in their car outside the building premises, killing the occupants of the car and damaging the wall behind, which I then molded the bullet damage from several weeks later. When ISIS rose to prominence in the Middle East, it was clear that I was going to have to examine what they were doing, because they were carrying out the biggest swathe of cultural destruction clearly since World War II. So I started to shift my focus to trying to get to grips with what this meant and why it was happening, which is the intention behind making these works. They're an attempt to understand. To do this, I traveled to Iraq with the help of the Kurdish military, the Peshmerga, with the aim of getting 2 ancient sites which had been liberated from ISIS to mold the damage left behind, so I could integrate those molds and the texture of them into works of art. The work on the screen is an ISIS bullet hole painting, which was exhibited in 2017 in New York at Thomas Yekel Gallery. The bullet damage was molded in the village of Tel Arabah, which was on the front line, as it was at that time, in the war against ISIS, just to the southwest of Kirkuk. A couple of years later, in early 2018, when Mosul had been taken back from ISIS, the Iraqi culture minister allowed me to access the recently liberated Mosul Museum, where I was given permission to take molds of ISIS smashed sculptures. You may remember that this was a very prominent moment in the rise of ISIS, where they took over this museum, and it was very prolifically disseminated around the media, especially through social media, images of them destroying sculptures. One of the works that resulted in that molding inside the Mosul Museum now hangs on permanent display at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Recently, the Victorian Albert Museum and the Iraq National Museum of Baghdad have also acquired ISIS-related works from me. The sales of these ISIS-related works generate a charitable contribution to a charity called Kind Aid. They're a children's organization which operates in the area where I first molded bullet damage in Iraq in 2015. So how did I come to be interested in the Channel Island of Alderney? Well, in 2019, a friend who had spent many years on Alderney sent me a lot of information about the occupation history. I was intrigued. Similarly to Taliban and ISIS, the Nazis were hell-bent on forcing their way of thinking and their approach to existence on everyone around them. They systematically deleted the cultures of the people and places they expanded into when they simply didn't care for them or wanted them removed. And Alderney was no exception to this. One of the things that I found remarkable is that the island was an idyllic agricultural community before the war, thatched cottages and rolling hills covered with wildflowers. The flowers are still there, of course, but by the time World War II ended, the nature of the island's identity had been irretrievably changed. The landscape had been altered forever by the construction of over 100 fortifications and gun emplacements, concrete-lined trenches, etc., which are still being uncovered to this day. The interiors of people's houses had been gutted. Often the roofs had been completely removed for their wooden floors, doors, roof structures, window frames, all of which were ripped out and used for fuel or for construction materials. In many instances, there was very little for the residents to return to after the war. It's worth mentioning that the inhabitants of Alderney were evacuated about 10 days before the Germans arrived on Alderney. They were removed by the British Navy. In many instances, there was very little for these residents to come home to. The island was also strewn with a vast number of landmines and unused artillery. Tunnels had been dug under the hills, and the stunning beaches on the island had been blocked off by vast anti-tank walls, and the harbour had been industrialised and made substantially larger. it was clear that the place would never be the same again. This is in many regards a classic example of the type of destruction of the identity of a place by an occupying military force. So here is Alderney, sitting in the Channel, 8 miles off the coast of France, circled in yellow on this map. Alderney has been a British dependency since 1066, when the Norman conquest took over England. William the Conqueror already owned Alderney, and so it became a crown dependency and has remained that way until the present day. In the 1850s, the British, as the islanders became known 700 years after the Norman conquest, built lots of enormous stone forts on the headlands on Alderney to keep out the French, who were driven, the English, the British, were driven by the fear as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. These defences, these Victorian forts, generated a scandal in the UK due to their vast cost. Later, as predicted by British politicians, they became very useful to the Germans when they took over Alderney in 1940. They didn't predict that they would be useful to the Germans, but that they would be useful if an occupying force took the island. The population of Alderney were evacuated by the UK British Navy in June 1940, as I mentioned, 10 days before the military arrived, German military. Note that Alderney is very much in close proximity to the Cherbourg Peninsula, which is to the east of the island, and the D-Day beaches marked in purple are further to the east and south along the Cherbourg Peninsula marked in purple. Alderney is the furthest northern of all the Channel Islands, which makes it strategically important. Any Allied invasion which would be planned to hit the coast of France in this area would need to go either east or west of the Cherbourg Peninsula. The British proposal for invasion of France was called Operation Hatred. It suggested going to the west of the Cherbourg Peninsula, taking back the Channel Islands, and then hitting the French beaches. But this was really about pride in taking back British soil. It would have slowed down the invasion, and the element of surprise would have been lost. The element of surprise which ultimately allowed D-Day to succeed. So instead, the invasion by the Allies went east of the Cherbourg Peninsula and hit D-Day beaches hard and fast. You know the history after that point. Hitler had personally ordered in October 1941 that the Channel Islands be turned into an impregnable fortress. This was exactly to deter an invasion to the west of the Cherbourg Peninsula, and it succeeded. It was a point of great pride to Hitler that he controlled these British islands. To deal with the invasion threat and to hold the islands, thousands of forced and slave laborers were brought in to build the concrete fortifications and gun emplacements on Alderney. This Ministry of Defence map from 1944 shows the results of the fortification of Alderney by the Germans. Everything marked in blue is a defensive device. A tank trap, minefields, barbed wire, walls, ditches, fences, anti-tank walls, gun positions, bunkers, concrete trenches, etc. The work was carried out with small exceptions by forced and slave laborers who were brought to the island in their thousands and worked on a brutal schedule with desperately little nourishment. They were Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Georgian, Belarusian, Crimean, Spanish, North African, and even a few from the Netherlands. There was a contingent of French Jews and French and German political prisoners. There are precious few documents about how many people were brought to the island to work, but we know that they numbered in their thousands. Some of these men were as young as 14 or 15 years old. They lived under terrible conditions, and it wasn't unusual for them to be worked to death in 3 to 4 months. The photo here shows Spanish force workers on Alderney. The labourers lived in the island's 4 main camps, which were called Helgoland, Borkum, Sylt, and Norderney. The workers were almost entirely under the control of Organisation Todd, the construction arm of the Nazi war machine, which built its airports, motorways, fortifications, government buildings, airports, U-boat pens, etc., etc., and which was described as running the biggest construction program in Europe since ancient Rome. It's at its height organisation, Todd, had 1.4 million labourers under its control. These labourers also built what's known as the Atlantic Wall, the fortifications which stretched between Sweden and Spain and were designed to deter the Allied coastal invasion. Alderney was part of the Atlantic Wall fortifications, and hence the name of the British proposed invasion plan, Operation Hadrian, literally a reference to Hadrian's Wall and the operation to break the Atlantic Wall. The situation of death through overwork, starvation rations, and beatings got worse for the labourers on Alderney when the SS arrived and took over the primary camp, Silt, a concentration camp, turning it into a very, very scary concentration situation with the number of 4 in charge of the SS guards on Alderney was a man called Otto Hogelow. According to witnesses who provided detailed accounts to the UK military authorities after the liberation in 1945, in what was known as the Panchev report, a page of which is on the screen now, Otto Hogelow incentivized the SS guards on the island to kill prisoners by offering them rewards. The red outline section at the bottom of the page is part of the Panchev report, which states this man gave 14 days leave, extra food, drink to guards for every 5 dead prisoners. It's barely a surprise labourers lived in constant fear that their lives would end at any moment. Reading the British military intelligence Panchev report and books on the occupation of Alderney, as well as a few years of research of my own with the help of researchers in the UK, US, Germany, Russia, and Spain, I've compiled a list of 43 separate eyewitness recorded incidents of shootings on Alderney, shootings of prisoners. In 2 of these 43 incidents, groups of prisoners were killed en masse in April 1943 and February 1944 because they were too ill to work. There's no question of the volume of evidence of a culture of shooting prisoners on this island. It wasn't a surprise when the site of this wall inside a Victorian fort called Platzeline on north shore of Alderney raised my eyebrows. So what exactly are we looking at? The wall is 4.5 meters long from left to right, then it starts to curve around the right-hand corner. The white mark on the left designates a height of 7 feet, 213 centimeters. Looking at the wall, I immediately thought about what would be needed to make a mold of it to those proportions from which I could produce a work of art. The red dots are placed digitally over pits in the walls, which to me looked exactly like bullet impact craters. They're formed of a cone shape with a radial outward blast and deep central impact point. Some of the craters have broken through the cement render to reveal the granite blocks underneath, which form the structure of the wall. I looked thoroughly at the wall, but I couldn't see any metal jammed into the crater marks, which might have indicated a lodged projectile, to use a forensic term, a bullet. I started looking at the texture of the craters. Similarly, just shrapnel damage on the exterior, for example, of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which I'd molded in 2012, these impact craters are marginally worn by weather. The large ones especially have kept their shape very well. The proximity to the sea, which is around about 40 feet at high tide, has inevitably affected them, but the wear is not significant enough that they can't be read. To my mind, all of this warranted further investigation. Fort Platzeline, indicated with the red square in this slide, is one of the Victorian forts which was built in response to the Napoleonic Wars. During the World War II occupation, 2 Guernsey men, Harry Ingruil and Hansel Duckerman, were brought to Alderney by the Germans as fishermen. They escaped to the UK in their fishing boat. They were picked up by the Navy and questioned. They were interrogated several times, and in one of those interrogations, they stated that Fort Platzeline was abandoned during the occupation. This is quite important. The data that they provided to MI19, who interrogated them, was considered to be of a B rating. An A rating is considered the highest possible intelligence value, and that quality, that type of quality is what one would expect, for example, from a professional spy. So when they say that Platte Celine was abandoned, it's safe to believe them. Here is a recent aerial view of Fort Platte Celine. It's an open air shop nowadays for the construction industry. You can drive in with a truck and buy cement bags or timber, for example. I've highlighted the wall which we're discussing in red in the middle of the photo. The more I thought about this wall and the culture of shooting on the island during the occupation, the more I was interested in seeking permission to make a mold of it. So with the help of an Alderney States member, I requested permission from the leaseholder who rents the building from the local government. And to my slight surprise, consent was given. The nature of the occupation of Alderney is pretty controversial amongst the inhabitants. They're divided roughly 50-50. The older inhabitants really just don't want to have to think about it, want to get on with living their lives, enjoying their retirement. And the younger inhabitants predominantly are interested in understanding what went on and getting to grips with it. So in October 2019, I made a trip back to Alderney with 2 sculpture technicians, and we took a mold of a 4.5 meter long, 2.1 meter high section of the wall inside the fort. The molding process works as follows. Firstly, we built a lean-to to keep rain off the wall and off ourselves, and then we mixed up molding silicone with a hardener and scrubbed it into the surface of the wall and the bullet impact marks in a very thin layer with soft brushes. This captures every detail down to the texture of an individual grain of coarse sand. The silicone is capable of picking up the difference on a book page between printed text and blank paper, so it's very high grade. Over 2 days, 2 thicker layers of silicone were applied and allowed to dry, and then a third, known as a butter coat, was applied, against which wooden boards were pressed. These layers harden against the board and become a contact surface on which, once the layers of silicone are removed, it can be aligned against the wooden boards so that the cast can be made later. An example of one of these wooden boards and the silicone layer is on the right-hand side on the screen. This process includes the molding of the interior of the impact marks, as I described, and it can capture related materials and trace elements on the surface of the wall. While the last coat of silicone was being applied, I made a cup of tea for the attendant at the construction yard, a fellow called Hayden, who casually told me that a couple of years earlier, he had dug a bullet out of the wall with his penknife. I was astonished and I asked, "Where is this bullet now?" He said, "In a cup in my desk drawer." I asked if I could buy it from him, and Hayden shrugged his shoulders and said, "No need, I'll give it to you. To be honest, I don't really know why I have it." So here on the left-hand side is the bullet which Hayden removed from the wall inside the fort and gave to me in a plastic bag. And on the right is a photo showing the separate pieces. The lead from the wall had a twist of copper around it. The copper is the remains of the jacket of the bullet. Almost all World War II bullets have jackets or formed out of a secondary metal, usually copper, and then later during the war, often steel. On my return to the UK, I contacted Shore Screen Scientifics, a metal forensics lab just outside Derby, with 25 years of forensics experience. Shore Screen specializes in metallurgical testing for the automobile, aviation, and Formula One industries. My question to Shore Screen was, if I procure standard issue World War II German, British, and American pistol, rifle, and light fully automatic ammunition, what type of comparative lead tests could they conduct? I was given the suggestion that they should carry out a chemical test known as inductively coupled plasma spectroscopy, which is also known as ICP. This would provide a list of the component elements of the lead and the samples which I provide, so the lead from the wall and the bullet samples. The test would enable me to see a breakdown of the volumes of each element within the metal. Since lead is an alloy, this breakdown would be very important in order to understand whether any similarities exist. So next I went back to a man called John Carlin. John is a retired police superintendent of Greater Manchester Police, 32 years of service. During that time, he served as tactical aid unit sergeant in Trafford, a uniform group inspector on Moss Side, and retired from the force as a national firearms commander in the Specialist Operations Unit. In his retirement, he's written government white papers on how to handle the legalities of collectible weapons. This is part of what you see on the screen at the moment. The weapons which he's advising on are predominantly antique. Then he runs a business on the side, renting genuine World War II militaria to the movie business. I asked John if he could procure unused German, British, and US rifle, pistol, and light fully automatic ammunition for a comparative lead test. I also explained that I was seeking the ammunition which was copper-coated and lead-cored, and if there were any standard issue ammunition rounds which I described, which didn't have copper coatings or lead cores, that I didn't need those. John told me he would buy some for me, but that it was likely he would have to purchase unopened original boxes of ammunition, which he would then decommission. So I agreed to this, explaining that I intended to cut open the bullets to retrieve the lead samples for testing. It seems that John was pretty serious about buying these unopened boxes. Here's a box of German bullets, which he purchased on my behalf. John provided me with British 9mm ammunition, German 9mm, which could be used in both pistols and light automatic rifles, and with Mauser ammunition. The Mauser rifle was the standard issue German rifle of World War II. It was effectively the AK-47 of its day. Germany made over 30 million of these rifles before the end of the war. All of the bullets were cut open by me and lumps of lead cut out and bagged and labeled one at a time. Then I sent them with the Alderney lead to Shaw Screen Scientifics. A couple of weeks later, Andrew Penny, one of the Shaw Screen employees, called me to say that he had a match with the wall lead from Alderney. But he had a question first. Had the lead ever been in contact with copper? Obviously, you now know the answer to this, but Andrew didn't, and I explained that lead had been in the wall for around about 75 years on Alderney and approximately 50 feet from the ocean most of that time, and that the lead was compressed into the remains of the copper jacket of the bullet. He sounded very happy to hear about this and explained that they had encountered a minor unanticipated blip in their graphs, which showed that the wall lead had registered an unexpected copper presence, but that this was completely explained by the decades of copper oxidation from the ocean and weather in physical proximity to the lead. He restated his findings that they had what they believed to be as close as possible a match, and that it was with the Mauser rifle round. Above is the results of this ICP test. Having discussed the test results with Andrew at some length, I thought for a couple of days about this result, and then went back to him to ask if the test ought to be conducted a second time for the sake of certainty. His response is above. It's on the screen at the moment. In essence, that it had been discussed within the lab, and they felt that it was a waste of time and resources, that they would receive exactly the same result. I then asked if he knew of any examples of such a test, ITC test, being carried out in order to provide evidence in court. And his answer, after consultation with his colleagues, was no. But this type of test had been used many times to bring an end to legal disputes, to prevent question marks and arguments ending up in court. So I thanked Andrew and told him that if This ITC test was sufficient and sufficiently reliable to stop legal proceedings, then it was certainly fine for my purposes. So I'd like to show you a couple of photos. The first is this one of a Mauser rifle. Mauser is easily recognized due to two features. In the butt of the rifle, the end that goes against your shoulder, is a bolt release lock, the round metal disc. Then at the barrel end, a metal rod, which is part of the bayonet assembly. These are highly distinctive and recognizable, and they are not present on any other rifles used by German forces during World War II. This second photograph shows Mauser carrying Germans walking down a street in Alderney. In the close-up of the photograph at the bottom of the screen, you can see the double line of the bayonet attachment. I've outlined it with a red circle in two places. It's clearly visible as the rifles are being twisted by the walking motion, just enough that the bayonet attachment, which is facing backwards, is visible as in the instant that the photograph is taken. In the second photograph taken on Alderney, the rifle bolt lock on the wooden stock of the rifle is very clear, it stands out, and the bayonet assembly is visible at the top of the same rifle as well. These photos make clear, as we would expect, that Mauser rifles, standard issue German foot soldier weapon, was present on Alderney during the occupation. So the wall was shot by German Mauser rifles. In considering how to move this analysis further, I was chatting with a friend in New York who said, I know exactly who you need to speak to, Nick Petracco. He went on, Nick is one of the most respected forensic scientists in the United States. He's now retired. He loves a challenge, lives in Long Island, and is an old friend of mine. So after exchanging a few emails and a couple of phone calls with Nick, my wife and I went for dinner with him and his wife in their house. And I presented Nick with my dilemma, and he very quickly volunteered to come to Alderney if I could cover the costs of flight and accommodation. And he said that he would bring his colleague, Peter Diakserk, a specialist in historic weapons and crime scene recreations. So on the screen at the moment is sections of the biographies of both Nick and Peter. On the left-hand side, Nick's bio in the section which is highlighted in red reads, Petracco was responsible for laboratory and crime scene casework, training personnel, testifying as an expert witness in legal proceedings. Mr. Petracco has both work experience and subject matter expertise in laboratory analysis of all physical evidence, crime scene investigation and reconstruction, firearms and tool marking analysis, pattern analysis, post-blast investigation, as well as chemical, biological and explosive investigations. Mr. Petracco has testified over 500 times in all types of civil and criminal hearings, proceedings, and trials. Upon his retirement, Mr. Petracco established his forensic science consultancy business. Peter's bio on the right-hand side of the screen, highlighted in red, the little section reads, guest lectures, delivered over 30 guest lectures to various audiences and academic settings, and on the following subjects: firearms, tool marks, explosives, microscopy, trace evidence, bullet ricochet, and shooting reconstruction. Abstracts. Presented over 100 presentations at forensic science meetings and conferences locally and nationally on subjects of firearms, tool marks, ricochet, shooting reconstruction, trace evidence, microscopy, gunshot residue, blood spatter, and explosives. They're scientists. Their analysis is entirely dependent on the findings that they discover by forensic methods and their research to understand the subject matter. Their conclusions are based completely on their findings and what they tell them. This is what I was seeking: forensic specialists with highly practiced and developed techniques which revolve around ballistics, bullet damage, shooting reconstruction, gunshot residue, etc. Knowledge that could be deployed to determine exactly what happened in relation to the bullet damage on this potential crime scene in Alderney. Then, of course, COVID got in the way for 2 years, and then Pete broke his ankle very badly, from which I'm glad to say he's now fully recovered. But in late June 2022, they came to Alderney to look at the wall in Fort Platte Saline. As we work our way through the next segment of this presentation, you're going to see that the approach becomes increasingly about patterns and pattern recognition. Nicholas and Peter are seeking to understand the patterns of bullet impact craters through repetition, understanding why the repetition of certain scenarios and procedures always generates recognizable patterns, which can then be categorized. Some slides from here on will have orange edges. I've added this color as I want to highlight that these slides are lifted directly from their report, which describes their findings, sometimes by explaining how these patterns occur and what we're seeing as a result of them. So how are executions by firing squad carried out? Like almost everything the military does, there's a detailed manual which describes how this activity should be conducted. Formal activity like an execution by firing squad is one of these. The picture on the screen at the moment shows 2 front pages from instruction manuals published by the US military. On the left from 1944 and on the right from 1959. The extent to which these instructions are unchanged is illustrated by the fact that the 1959 manual describes execution by shooting as execution by musketry. The instructions outlined in these manuals are repeated in military guidelines all over the world. Muskets, or front-loading rifles, were phased out of the US military when the Springfield 45 government was introduced in 1873, just after the American Civil War. In other words, the proceedings described in these manuals is almost unchanged since the American Civil War, and that's because it's procedural. That means that execution laws have been damaged by the same procedures for 150 years. 99% of the instructions are the same between these 2 manuals, instructing that half a dozen soldiers be provided with rifles lined up at 15 paces, equivalent to 37.5 feet, which is important, and you'll hear why in a few moments, with witnesses to the left or the right at a similar distance. If it's a formal execution, the hands of the prisoner or feet bound, hood over the head, with an order given by a commanding officer to raise rifles, aim, and then fire. If the prisoner doesn't die, a coup de grace shot is given to the head of the prisoner by the commanding officer at a specified distance from the skull, aimed at a specific place on the head. These instructions repeat, as I've mentioned, in military guidelines all over the world. I should mention that the coming photographs are pretty severe. They're a bit grim. They're of execution sites. And if you don't feel like looking, this is the moment to look away, and I'll tell you when to look back. So why does this formal process, this format of executions matter? Well, it matters a lot because executions by firing squads generate, as I mentioned, a specific type of bullet impact scatter pattern, which is similar all across the world. They go back about 300 years, and they're remarkably recognizable. To demonstrate this, I'm going to show you a couple of slides from the new forensic report, which highlight the degree of similarity in the organization of firing squads and then hence the damage marks left. The main similarities are an isolated or secluded location for an execution, mostly enclosed sites, in other words, out of sight, fortifications, prisons, pre-structured sites, woods, trenches, and with backdrops consisting of sand or soil walls, banks of earth, forests, sometimes concrete walls, using rifles or handguns, prisoners' eyes covered with blindfold or hood if they choose, and usually using 5 to 10 shooters. Prisoners standing, kneeling, or stooped, typically shooters 6 to 10 meters away from the target. Damage to the wall backdrops, meaning bullet impact craters, are generally 17 to 14 centimeters in diameter when impacting concrete with a rifle. They range from approximately 30 centimeters above the ground, although it can be lower, to 2.5 meters high. Even before the advent of photography, artists even recorded the scenarios and the imagery of executions from written accounts in this highly recognizable format that I've just described. The illustrations made by artists are not reliable as evidence in any way, but the point is that they illustrate that as long as history records, execution by firing squad is procedural and it's largely unchanged. Here's another selection of the same examples from clockwise from top left. Japan in World War II, execution by German soldiers in World War II, Russian World War II, Ireland in 1916, Netherlands 1945, Nigeria bottom left in 1995, Chile in 1954, Mexico City in 1927. All show the isolated or secluded locations, walls, wooden posts, sand or soil banks, forests sometimes as backdrops. In Nigeria, in this photograph bottom left, they used old oil barrels to absorb the gunfire. Shooters using rifles almost without exception in these instances. Prisoners' eyes covered, shooters 5 to 10 in number, prisoners standing, kneeling, or stooped, typically 6 to 10 meters from the target. So this is the last of these photos, which I'm going to show you. I hope that you're seeing this procedural pattern that I'm describing. This photograph is from the Battle of the Bulge towards the end of World War II. In the bottom half of the screen, you can see close-up photographs of the bullet impact craters, and this is helpful because you can see, I'm going to abbreviate bullet impact crater, the phrase, to BIC from here on. So when I say BIC, I'm talking about bullet impact crater. In the bottom left of the screen, you can see the wooden post which a prisoner was tied to. There's a wide cluster of BICs from left to right in this photograph. The height spread of the BICs are usually, as I said, up to 2.5 meters, some below 30 centimeters, but why? And why in this area? Well, when the military ask a group of soldiers to shoot an unarmed person, some won't do it. They have to follow the orders, but they shoot to the left or to the right or high or low and miss deliberately. They might shoot into the prisoner's shoulder or side, for example, but this is why the bullets often go wide of their mark. And this is why there's a need for 5 to 10 shooters to execute a single person. If for some reason they still don't succeed in killing the prisoner because nobody is willing to shoot the individual, as I mentioned before, it can happen. The officer conducting the execution is obliged to step forward and deliver the coup de grace shot. Inside the fort of Platte Saline on Alderney, there's a concrete floor. The coup de grace shot, the point-blank range would be done with a handgun. For a German in World War II, this is a 9mm Luger. Note that amongst the ammunition, I had Shawscreen Scientific's test for lead comparison was a standard issue German 9mm bullet, which would have fitted into a Luger or a Schmeiser fully automatic rifle. A shot at that close range from a Luger would pass through somebody's head, bounce off the concrete floor and strike the wall. It could strike the wall anywhere from ankle height upwards. So this is one reason why there are often BICs at ankle level and above on an execution wall. The larger the number of people shot against the wall, the broader the scatter pattern of BICs. Is it safe to shoot a person against a concrete wall? What prevents the bullet bouncing back and killing the shooter? Well, unlike target practice, when a soldier shoots at a paper or wooden or cardboard target, if a bullet passes through a person, it slows down considerably before it hits whatever is behind them. If a shooter misses, and many do so deliberately, as I've mentioned, the bullet will either lodge itself into the wall or impact and bounce back. And this is why the US military pamphlets state that shooters should stand back at 15 paces, which is 37 feet. So if the bullet impact craters, the bits on an execution wall look a certain way, by comparison, what do the bits on other war damaged walls usually look like? Well, Nicholas did a comparison and a contrast of them. So let's take a look. In the photos on the screen now, you can see that these are attacking or defensive bits. They're scattered up and down the walls, ranging to the full height of each building, and from left to right as far as the building stretches, without any height or width limits. The reason for the far wide-ranging spread of damage on an attacking or defending building is that heavy fire will be laid down onto a building for a longer period of time to prevent defending soldiers from reacting, therefore enabling attacking soldiers to advance. By reviewing the flat saline wall again, you can see that the predominant density of BICs are within the 2.5 meter height.
See it right there. My finger's touching it right now. That. Okay. Wow. Yeah. Here we go. Coming your way. It's still attached. Can you go in here? Sure. Oh, there we go.
Does it feel dense like lead?
Oh yeah.
That's
Yeah.
excellent.
That's lead for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And of course, we'll test it.
Yeah. Got one more over here.
Okay, cool.
So when we looked at the fort wall, we decided
See it.
to take a look at also what appeared to be bullet damage on an anti-tank wall a couple of 100 yards away, which is what you've just seen, to the east of the fort. Most of the damage on the surface of that wall was actually due to the internal steel structure, which was within the concrete, rusting, expanding, and popping off sections of concrete. Initially, it did look like a far greater number of bullet impact craters than were actually there. With a handheld metal detector, we found what we thought may be 2 lead bullets and separate impact craters. So Peter Diakson set about using chisels to remove them. This is what you just watched. One of the 2 pieces of lead was then examined under the microscope in New York, and at the laboratory of John Jay College of Criminal Justice by Nicholas Petracco. Nicholas was specifically looking for any fibers or material fragments, such as bone, that may have been folded into the lead on impact. Procuring material in this way is a process which he has developed over many years by unfolding the lead under an extremely powerful microscope. In this film, you can see that he's
to concrete. So it's just the part of the ball impacted the wall, this side, the other side. No, didn't impact it.
So in that short film, he's looking at the impact texture where the bullet hit the wall. Nick said that the texture, which you could see on the right-hand side of the piece of lead, carried the grains of silica, concrete, and quartz, but no organic clothing fibers or human trace elements. Ultimately, the bullets didn't provide us with any useful information, but they were helpful in confirming that that wall had been shot at, although at the time and present discussion about Platzeline fort wall wasn't informed any further by those pieces of lead which we found. When we were inside Fort Platzeline, Nicholas and Peter asked me to measure the distance between the damaged wall and the perpendicular wall. The distance was 40 feet. When I asked why they needed this, they told me that the shooting of concrete wall from 40 feet would allow sufficient distance to be safe from what they referred to as splashback, a term used to describe bouncing bullets and particles of organic material such as bone. They both determined that between them, this would have been a safe, likely distance, and this correlates with the US manual's request, the US military manual request, that shooters stand back 15 paces, 37.5 feet, so that the available space in the fort does allow for executions by firing a squad from a safe distance. What do the bullet impact crater shapes on the wall in Platzerline tell us? The BICs are predominantly round, very close to a round shape, as you can see in the photo on the left, which is a small section of the wall. Each BIC has an impact point in the center of each crater. They are not oval or elliptical shapes, which would indicate that incoming projectiles have hit the wall at a steep angle, such as from the left or from the right or from above. The shots photographed on the left are also predominantly circular in form and on the right-hand side of the wall, so all the way across from one end to the other. This indicates that the projectiles which hit the wall were shot all the way across, perpendicular to the wall, facing it directly. In other words, all the shots were fired from multiple perpendicular positions, as indicated in the arrows in the right-hand photograph, in keeping with a row of shooters in a line, as confirmed by Peter Diacto, who, as you've seen, specialist crime scene recreation in the arena of gunshots. This indicates very clearly that shots which struck the fort wall were fired from inside the walls of the fort. Peter recreated a small version of the Platzerline interior wall at his home in Pennsylvania and shot at it with a Mauser rifle using ammunition from 1938. The aim of this was to see if there was a correlation between the BICs on the fort and the simulated BICs made under controlled conditions. In the fort, there's a range of sizes of bullet impact craters. They go from 2 to 13 centimeters across. This is overwhelmingly consistent across the wall. The larger BICs are predominantly between 5 and 10 centimeters across, but some of the smaller ones slightly larger, up to 13. In the photograph above, an average BIC is shown in the top left with the red circle around it. This one is about 5 centimeters across, with the central impact point, which again indicates perpendicular firing position. At the smaller end of the scale, the BICs are often more shallow, and most of them with less pronounced indentation in the center. Many of these smaller BICs on the wall are from 2 or 3 centimeters across. So back in rural Pennsylvania, Peter shoots his concrete recreation of the Fort Platzerline wall, which was a concrete render over a solid concrete substrate, with his Mauser rifle and then with a 9mm Luger pistol, both from a distance of 40 feet. The impact marks created in the lower half of the screen are produced by Peter. The Mauser rifle shots create visually comparable BICs, with the central impact indentations around 8.9 centimeters wide on the left and 11.4 centimeters wide on the right. Peter says that these are within the acceptable parameters to be described as consistent with the 4 BICs. Peter then fired at his recreation of the wall through a material which is known as ballistic gelatin. Ballistic gelatin is a material used by forensics and ballistic specialists to simulate the density of parts of the human body. Peter shot through a piece of ballistic gelatin with a volume which simulates the human torso. The resulting BIC is on the right-hand corner, lower right-hand corner of the photograph that we're looking at. And note that this BIC is more shallow as its velocity has been greatly reduced, and it does not have a pronounced deeper central impact mark of the holes to its left. The ballistic gelatin BIC is 6.3 centimeters across. And again, Peter said that this is within acceptable parameters to be described as consistent with smaller, shallower BICs on the fort wall, which are shown on the right, top right. Remember that I mentioned that there are many of these indentation marks which are shallow. When Peter shot at this test wall from 40 feet with the Luger pistol, it made a very, very slight impact mark 3 centimeters across. Again, as Peter describes, acceptable parameters to be described as consistent with the smaller, yet smaller, shallower BICs on the fort wall, of which there are many. So before presenting conclusions, I think it's a good idea to look quickly at 3 theories which have been put forward about the nature of the BICs on the wall inside Platzerline. One suggestion speculates that the wall inside the fort was a target practice wall. In target practice, shooting is done towards targets which are set at the optimum range distance for the weapon being used. So for a Mauser rifle, this is around 250 to 300 yards. Only 40 feet distance is available inside the fort. Shooting a concrete wall inside an enclosed space without something like a human body to slow down the bullet, on impact is likely to result in the shooter shooting themselves, as we've described. Under these circumstances, the risk to the shooters is extremely high. On firing ranges, targets are set apart at equal distances and are shot many times over many weeks, months, and years. The resulting impact pattern on a firing range backstop, such as the thin metal sheets on the range on the right-hand side of this photo, is extremely dense and very created an area of damage, with a space and then the next target, the same type of damage pattern, very intensive and very deep, then another space, another target, an equal damage pattern, etc., on down the line. It's difficult to imagine how severe difficult to imagine how severe the equally spaced cratering would be on the wall inside Fort Platzerline if the wall had been used this way, which clearly it hasn't, as there is no similar or even vaguely related impact clustering. Military firing ranges for rifles are outdoors. In fact, there is one on Alderney to the southeast of London Common. Since such target practice is not carried out inside enclosed spaces, and the BICs on the walls in Fort Platzerline don't correlate in any way to this firing range damage, the notion of the wall being used for target practice can be quite easily dismissed. Another suggestion is the wall was shot from a nearby machine gun position. So looking at the photo of the fort again, bear in mind that the BICs on the wall show that the shots again were fired from within the fort. Central impact points show that the shooters were standing perpendicular. For a machine gun position to be able to strike the wall we're examining in this way, it would need to be able to fire over the fort wall, the perimeter wall, but remain perpendicular to the bullet damaged wall. And the necessary trajectory to achieve this is outlined in red in the photo, which would require the machine gun position to be on the beach, which would mean it was in the water, in the sea at high tide, and in an elevated position above the height of the fort walls. As we know from aerial photographs of the occupation, no such gun position existed, and if it had, extraordinary care would have needed to have been taken to damage only the wall which we're discussing. Of course, to make horizontal BICs like the ones that exist, the bullets will need to also level themselves out inside the fort after being fired and strike the wall a few degrees from horizontal, which defies the laws of physics. To add further layers of complexity within this theory, machine gun ammunition would need to actually slow down before impacting the wall to hit the wall gently, simulating the low caliber arms fire which has damaged the wall inside the fort. Since we're discussing this machine gun, known as fully automatic weapons, fire in practice was carried out on Alderney, and I found some details about how it was done. It was always carried out firing towards the ocean and actually into the ocean, not towards the island. As we can see in the photo at the top left of the slide, which was taken on Alderney during the occupation. This type of fully automatic firing practice happened on 2 days of the week, Thursdays until 1 p.m. and on Fridays, always facing north across the North Shore. the targets were always placed in the ocean. And this, curiously, is why the two celebrated fishermen who I spoke about earlier, Harry Inglewill and Hansel Duckerman, had to escape to England in their fishing boat on a specific day of the week, because Thursday and Friday, when fishing was banned, and so they couldn't leave, as they stated in their interrogations to MI19 when they arrived in the UK. So clearly the wall wasn't shot by a machine gun position anywhere, inverted commas, nearby. The last suggestion about how bullet damage came to be inside the wall, the fort at Platzeline, is the suggestion that, in inverted commas, a bored soldier shot the wall. Let's look at this realistically. Hitler had a personal interest in the defense of the Channel Islands. Himmler personally selected the island's concentration camp commander. The hierarchy of the Nazi Party was involved on a personal level and acutely aware of the importance of the island to the Atlantic Wall fortifications, and as history shows, they were right in doing so. And as for their interest in the island's position in the Atlantic Wall, is what I'm saying, and for the defense of France. So given this backdrop to the island's occupation, wasting over 150 rounds of ammunition in such a key defensive frontline position, when an invasion by occupied Europe, an invasion of occupied Europe was expected imminently, and where resupply after D-Day was exceptionally difficult, if not impossible, it would be extremely unlikely and met with severe punishment if somebody had decided to fire off 150 rounds without good reason. Added to these factors, the sound of such volumes of gunfire would have attracted considerable, that would have resounded for a considerable distance, would have attracted alarmed attention and likely a rush of activity to see what's going on. In a state of constant readiness, these frontline soldiers are rarely willing to risk their ability to defend themselves by wasting more ammunition than they're able to carry. So this claim is clearly also implausible and can be dismissed. As Nicholas Petracco and Peter Diakzuk have pointed out in their report, executions usually took place in secluded locations, which Fort Platzeline is. I think it's worth being aware that the closest buildings to the fort during the occupation was Helderland Camp, which for the first half of the war was used to house exclusively the Jewish prisoners. Before the camp was dismantled, and the Jewish prisoners were moved further east on the island to Alderney Camp. On the left-hand photograph on the screen, you can see the fort of Alderney underneath, circled in red. On the fort, the bullet damage wall is highlighted. Second point in this slide is that around a year ago, I was told about a book which was written by an Alderney man called Anthony Katz, whose pre and post World War II life on Alderney was published and then serialized in one of the Alderney magazines. Most of it's based on his diary entries, and it recounts how he was taught to drive by a German man who'd been stationed on the island during the occupation, and who'd returned there after the war, and then decided to stay and live there. This man, who was named Hans, recounted to Anthony Katz shootings of slave laborers against the anti-tank wall, which extends east from Fort Platzeline, the same wall which Peter and myself retrieved lead from earlier in this talk. You saw the film. Anthony's description is on the top of the screen on the right, and it reads, speaking about his friend Hans, he told me about the slave labor camps and of the shooting of several slave labor workers against the anti-tank concrete wall at Platzeline. He told me about several more being shot on the bend just past the nunnery, a different building which is to the east of the island, where the bullet holes can still be seen. Now, I can't tell you who was shot in front of the wall at Platzeline, but the ballistics and the forensics which I've presented makes it very clear that this is an execution wall. So in conclusion, As a result of the research conducted by Shore Screen Scientific, Nicholas Petracco, Peter Diaxer, and the researchers in the UK, US, Spain, and Russia, we know the following. The British military did not make a habit of shooting up the interior of their defensive positions. There is no record of bullet damage existing before the German occupation. Fort Platzeline has a very heavily bullet impact cratered interior wall. The recommended safe distance available for a firing squad to shoot at a wall at a perpendicular position is available inside the fort. The majority of the BICs range across the extent of the wall from right to left and top to bottom, with a predominant cutoff of 2.5 meters in height. Known execution walls generate this recognizable pattern. The BIC pattern, scatter pattern, is generated as a result of procedural processes of actions by firing squads with very few changes over time across the world. And executions by firing squads are usually carried out in secluded locations, which out of sight and often utilize a backdrop in the form of a wall. The form of the BICs demonstrate that the shots fired at the wall were fired from within the fort. As a result of the comparative lead test, we know that German Mauser rifles were used to shoot at the wall in Fort Platzeline. There were no German rifles left behind on Alderney when the civilians returned. We also know that there was a culture of shooting prisoners on Alderney, and that the SS guards were incentivized to kill prisoners in the form of the promise of food, drink, and leave for every 5 prisoners killed. There was a witness statement documented by an island resident that executions were carried out in the immediate vicinity and elsewhere on the island. I have documented 43 incidents of shootings on the island, which are recorded in British military paperwork, making clear that executions were carried out extensively on Alderney. The comparison shooting tests by Peter Diaxer with his Mauser rifle and Luger pistol and with ballistic gelatin are comparable with the BICs observed on the wall in the fort. And all of this, to be honest, strikes me as an overwhelming volume of information in favor of an understanding that this was a World War II execution wall. Nicholas Petracco's summary states, in the opinion of the undersigned, the questioned interior concrete wall designated Shot Wall 1 contains firing squad execution pattern discussed and revealed in this study. Thus, SW1, Shot Wall 1, possesses the necessary physical evidence to be designated a firing squad execution site. So I asked Nicholas on the phone a few days ago, playing devil's advocate, if someone sued to prove that your analysis is wrong, would you sit on a witness stand to testify about what your findings show? And he answered instantly, and without any hesitation, I'd do it tomorrow. Since his expert forensics testimony, as demonstrated by over 500 legal proceedings and court cases, convicted many people over several decades, I think that that's sufficient for me personally. So I'm approaching the end of this talk, and I just wanted to mention now that a small cast section of this wall will be on view at an exhibition which opens on the 15th of March at an exhibition space called Cromwell Place, which is in South Kensington. On the screen now you can see what the full-size rendering of the work would look like at 4.5 meters long. The exhibition will also contain a variety of other works related to Alderney. Believe it or not, this execution wall investigation is only one strain of work which is in this exhibition. And the other works include prints, infographics, and cast relief sculptures. So please do come along and take a look if you're interested in this. This brings me to the conclusion of my talk. So I'd like to thank you again for taking the time to listen, whether you're here in person or logged in online. And I'm very grateful for you giving me my time, and I thank you very much.
Okay. I'm not sure we've ever had anything as comprehensive and the forensic details. I feel like I've watched a TV documentary. It's really quite incredible. Thank you. And I know we were worried about it being read, but you read it so beautifully that it wasn't like reading
And I didn't
a thing. I know your voice actually got stronger as you went along. So all good. We obviously don't have time for questions. I apologise. There was so much in that if you want to watch it again, we have recorded it. It is available. Just let me or the box office know, and we'll send you it so you can listen to it again, because there was a lot of material in that. Real amount. I mean, yes,
I would like to add one more thing just before you leave. My email is up on the screen. If anybody has a question and would like to know something about this, or would like to know any further information of any form of it, if I can answer the question, I will. Please email me.
And if you don't take that down, you can obviously email us and we'll pass it on to Piers as well.
And any questions, please just email them through.
There we go. Thank you all on Zoom. Thank you in the room. And thank you so much, Piers. Really amazing. Thank you. Have a good journey home, and look forward to seeing you back again.
There was a program about burial sites in Alderney.
Yeah.
On PBS, I don't know if you saw it.
I'm familiar with
Yeah.
the
They had an awful lot of